Dark Side of Human Nature, A Journey Through Philosophical Shadows. Introduction. Welcome, night wanderer. In these quiet hours when sleep eludes you and thoughts grow deeper, you've found yourself here, at the threshold of understanding the shadows within us all. I am your guide through the darkness tonight, as we embark on a journey into the most hidden corridors of human nature. What makes us capable of both extraordinary compassion and unspeakable cruelty? Why do we build civilizations only to destroy them? How do we reconcile our highest aspirations with our basest instincts? Tonight we delve into these questions through the insights of history's greatest philosophical minds. From ancient wisdom to modern psychology, we'll examine the darkness that dwells within the human condition, not to despair, but to understand. As you rest and perhaps drift towards sleep, allow these contemplations to settle in your mind like stones in still water, creating ripples of understanding that may continue long after consciousness fades. Our exploration begins with a fundamental question: what is this darkness we speak of, and why does it persist across all of human history? The nature of darkness. The shadow self. Carl Jung proposed that within each of us exists a shadow, the collection of aspects we deny, repress, or hide from our conscious selves. This shadow contains what we deem unacceptable, yet it remains an integral part of our wholeness. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow is not inherently evil, it is merely hidden. When denied expression, however, it can manifest in destructive ways. The person who claims absolute moral purity might secretly harbor the darkest impulses, acting them out unknowingly, or projecting them onto others. Consider how often the most vociferous critics of a behavior are later discovered to engage in precisely what they condemn. This is the shadow at work. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we attack in others with righteous fervor. Yet Jung believed integration of the shadow, coming to terms with our darker aspects, was essential for psychological health. Only by acknowledging our capacity for darkness can we truly choose the light. The beast within. Sigmund Freud identified what he called the ID, our primal, instinctual drives. Beneath the veneer of civilization, these ancient impulses remain: aggression, domination, sexual desire unbound by social constraint or moral consideration. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud argued that society itself is built upon the repression of these instincts. The social contract demands we sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term stability. Yet this bargain creates an inevitable tension, the discontents of which Freud spoke. Men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, Freud observed. They are creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. This perspective offers a sobering assessment. Civilization is not humanity's natural state, but an artificial construct maintained through constant psychological repression. Remove the structures of society, law, moral education, mutual accountability, and the beast emerges with terrifying speed. History provides ample evidence. When social restraints collapse during war, genocide, or civil breakdown, humanity's capacity for cruelty manifests with shocking immediacy. The beast was never gone, merely leashed. Evil, absence, or presence. Ancient philosophical traditions diverged on a fundamental question: is evil a force unto itself, or merely the absence of good? Augustine of Hippo, following Neoplatonic thought, proposed that evil has no substance of its own. It is a privation like darkness is the absence of light, cold, the absence of heat. Evil is the absence of good. In this view, we do not choose evil because it is evil, but because we mistake it for some apparent good. The implication is profound. Even in our darkest acts, we are seeking something we perceive as good: pleasure, power, security, relief from suffering, but through distorted means. Eastern philosophical traditions offer parallel insights. In Buddhist thought, evil actions spring not from an essential wickedness, but from ignorance, a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. The person who causes harm is caught in delusion, unable to perceive the interconnectedness of all beings. Conversely, Thomas Aquinas proposed that while evil may be an absence, it takes on a certain reality through human choice. When we willfully turn from what we know to be good, evil becomes an active force through our agency. Modern psychology has largely moved away from metaphysical conceptions of evil, favoring explanations rooted in developmental trauma, neurological impairment, or social conditioning. Yet the question remains: does this fully account for humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty and calculated malevolence? The darkness in society, the social contract and its fragility. Thomas Hobbes envisioned human life without government as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. In his view, our natural state is perpetual conflict, a war of all against all. During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, Hobbes wrote in Leviathan, they are in a condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. The social contract theory proposed by Hobbes, and later refined by John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, suggests that we surrender certain freedoms to a governing authority in exchange for protection and stability. This bargain restrains our darker impulses through mutual agreement. Yet history demonstrates the fragility of this arrangement. Economic collapse, resource scarcity, or perceived threats from outsiders can quickly unravel the social fabric. Groups that peacefully coexisted for generations suddenly turn against one another, as witnessed in countless civil conflicts throughout human history. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, revealed how quickly ordinary people adopt roles of cruelty when social structures permit or encourage it. College students randomly assigned as guards in a simulated prison began psychologically tormenting those assigned as prisoners, despite knowing it was merely an experiment. The disturbing implication is that many social norms preventing cruelty are more tenuous than we care to admit, conventional rather than inherent, and therefore subject to rapid dissolution under the right conditions. Collective shadow, scapegoating and moral panics. Jung's concept of the shadow operates not only in individuals but in collective consciousness. Societies project their disowned aspects onto marginalized groups, creating scapegoats who bear the psychological burden of the community's shadow. Throughout history, we see this pattern repeated. Witches, heretics, racial and religious minorities, or ideological enemies become repositories for collective fears and repressed impulses. By focusing hatred on these groups, the majority maintains an illusion of moral purity. René Girard explored this mechanism in his mimetic theory, proposing that scapegoating serves to channel otherwise unmanageable social violence. By directing aggression toward a symbolic victim, communities temporarily restore harmony, a dark bargain that has structured much of human society. Moral panics, periods of intense public fear about perceived threats to social values, reveal this mechanism in action. From the Salem witch trials to modern conspiracy theories, these episodes demonstrate how easily rational assessment gives way to collective shadow projection. The Holocaust represents perhaps the most systematic manifestation of this dark potential. An entire society's economic anxieties, wounded national pride, and repressed violence found expression in the systematic dehumanization and murder of millions deemed other. What makes this aspect of human darkness particularly troubling is how it transforms individual people of normal moral capacity into participants in collective evil. As Hannah Arendt observed in her analysis of Adolf Eichmann, such evil often manifests not as diabolical malevolence, but as bureaucratic banality, ordinary people following orders, avoiding confrontation, and compartmentalizing moral responsibility. The machinery of obedience. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments following World War II revealed humanity's troubling readiness to inflict harm when directed by authority figures. Participants believed they were administering increasingly painful electric shocks to strangers as part of a learning experiment. Despite hearing cries of pain, actually recordings, approximately 65% continued to the maximum voltage when instructed by a researcher in a lab coat. Milgram concluded, ordinary people simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. This tendency toward obedience likely evolved as an adaptive trait for social cohesion. In prehistoric communities, quick compliance with leaders during threats might have been critical for group survival. Yet in complex modern societies, this same impulse can facilitate institutional evil on an unprecedented scale. The defense of following orders emerged repeatedly during the Nuremberg trials, revealing how easily moral agency becomes subsumed by hierarchical structures. The machinery of obedience transforms ordinary individuals into instruments of systems that may operate according to profoundly inhuman logic. What makes this aspect of darkness particularly insidious is how it distributes responsibility across systems, making it difficult to assign blame. The guard who turns the key, the clerk who processes the paperwork, the engineer who designs the facility. Each plays a small role in outcomes none would likely choose as autonomous moral agents. Philosophical explorations of darkness. Nietzsche and the will to power. Friedrich Nietzsche proposed that beneath our civilized pretensions lies a fundamental drive he called the will to power. More than mere survival or pleasure-seeking, this drive compels us to extend our influence, overcome resistance, and transform our environment according to our desires. The world seen from within, the world described and defined according to its intelligible character, it would be will to powers and nothing else. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, unlike Freud, who viewed our primal drives as problematic forces to be controlled, Nietzsche saw the will to power as the essential creative force in human life. When suppressed or denied, it festers and emerges in distorted forms: resentment, psychological manipulation, or ideological fanaticism. Nietzsche's critique of conventional morality was that it often represented the resentment of the weak disguised as virtue, what he called slave morality. True morality, in his view, required honest confrontation with our darker drives and their creative transformation. His famous statement that God is dead was not merely a declaration of atheism, but a recognition that Western civilization faced a profound crisis, the collapse of its foundational values without clear replacements. In this vacuum, Nietzsche feared humanity would either embrace nihilism or cling desperately to empty moral formulas. The Übermensch or Superman Nietzsche envisioned was not a tyrant, but one who could face the darkness within human nature without flinching, creating meaning in a world without transcendent guarantees. Existentialism and the burden of freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre proposed that human beings are condemned to freedom, thrust into existence without inherent purpose. We must create meaning through our choices. This radical freedom is both our glory and our burden. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself, Sartre wrote. This existential perspective places tremendous responsibility on each individual. We cannot blame our nature, our society, or our past for who we become. We are the authors of ourselves through our choices. Yet this freedom produces what Sartre called anguish, the vertigo of possibilities, the weight of responsibility. To escape this burden, we often resort to what he termed bad faith, self-deception that denies our freedom by pretending our choices are predetermined or inevitable. Albert Camus explored a related aspect of darkness in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, confronting what he called the absurd, the human need for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. Camus saw suicide as the fundamental philosophical question, yet he rejected this response, advocating instead for a clear-eyed rebellion against absurdity through authentic living. Existentialism reveals a unique form of darkness, not evil or cruelty, but the terror of radical responsibility. Many atrocities occur not because humans are inherently evil, but because they flee from the burden of moral choice into the comfort of deterministic ideologies, religious absolutism, or blind obedience. Schopenhauer and the Will to Live. Arthur Schopenhauer offered one of philosophy's bleakest assessments of human existence. He identified the fundamental force in nature as the will to live, a blind, insatiable drive that perpetually creates desire and suffering. Life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom, Schopenhauer wrote. In his view, the brief satisfactions we experience merely create the conditions for new desires and new suffering. This endless cycle constitutes the fundamental tragedy of existence. Schopenhauer saw evidence for his perspective in nature's ruthless competition, creatures devouring one another in an endless struggle for survival. Human beings, despite their intellect, remain subject to this same relentless will. Yet Schopenhauer did not counsel despair. Through art, compassion, and ascetic practices, he believed we could temporarily transcend the will's tyranny. By recognizing ourselves in others, compassion becomes possible, a brief respite from the otherwise selfish imperatives of the will. His philosophy influenced numerous artists and thinkers, including Wagner, Tolstoy, and Freud, who recognized in Schopenhauer's will a precursor to his own concept of the unconscious drives. The darkness Schopenhauer illuminates is not a corruption of human nature, but its fundamental condition, an insight that resonates with Buddhist conceptions of dukkha, or suffering, as intrinsic to existence itself. Psychological dimensions of darkness. The authoritarian personality. Following World War II, Theodor Adorno and colleagues conducted extensive research into the psychological traits that predispose individuals toward fascist ideologies. They identified what they called the authoritarian personality, characterized by rigid adherence to conventional values, submission to authority figures, aggression toward outgroups, and black and white thinking. Such individuals display particular intolerance for ambiguity and a strong desire for clear hierarchies. When faced with complexity or uncertainty, they gravitate towards simplified worldviews that divide the world into good and evil, us and them. Later research by Bob Altermeyer refined this concept into right-wing authoritarianism, characterized by three core attitudes: authoritarian submission, authoritarian aggression, and conventionalism. Individuals scoring high on these measures tend to support punitive policies, military aggression, and restrictions on civil liberties. What makes this aspect of darkness particularly troubling is its normalcy. These are not pathological traits, but variations within normal psychological functioning. Under conditions of perceived threat or uncertainty, authoritarian tendencies can rapidly gain social acceptance. The desire for order, clarity, and security that drives authoritarianism is fundamentally human. The darkness emerges in how readily these ordinary desires transform into support for oppressive systems when activated by fear, cognitive biases, and moral blindness. Our minds employ numerous shortcuts, cognitive biases, that served evolutionary purposes, but can lead us morally astray. Confirmation bias leads us to notice evidence supporting our existing beliefs, while ignoring contradictory information. In-group bias causes us to judge the actions of our community more favorably than those of outsiders. These biases create moral blind spots. Studies show people will judge identical actions differently depending on whether they were performed by members of their political party, religion, or nationality. The fundamental attribution error causes us to explain others' behavior by their character, while attributing our own actions to circumstances. When others act badly, they are bad people. When we do the same, we were under pressure or made a mistake. These cognitive distortions operate largely outside conscious awareness, creating the troubling possibility that we can participate in systematic injustice while maintaining positive self-perception. Research on moral disengagement by Albert Bandura identifies several mechanisms through which ordinary people justify harmful acts. Moral justification: reframing harmful actions as serving a worthy purpose. Euphemistic labeling: using sanitized language to describe harmful actions. Advantageous comparison: making harmful actions seem acceptable relative to worse alternatives. Displacement of responsibility: attributing decisions to authorities. Diffusion of responsibility: distributing blame across a group, disregarding consequences. Minimizing the harm caused. Dehumanization: stripping victims of human qualities. Attribution of blame: claiming victims deserved their treatment. Through these psychological mechanisms, individuals maintain moral self-image while participating in actions they would condemn if viewed objectively. The banality of evil: Hannah Arendt's coverage of Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem led to her controversial but profound insight into what she called the banality of evil. Expecting to encounter a monster, she instead found a mediocre bureaucrat who organized the transportation of millions to death camps with the same administrative detachment he might have applied to shipping furniture. The trouble with Eichmann, Arendt wrote, was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. This normality represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of human darkness. Evil rarely announces itself with melodramatic villainy. Instead, it emerges through ordinary people, making small compromises, following procedures, and avoiding inconvenient moral reflection. Eichmann exemplified what psychologist Robert J. Lifton called doubling, the psychological creation of a separate self that performs actions the core self would find reprehensible. This compartmentalization allows individuals to participate in atrocities while preserving their self-conception as decent people. The banality of evil reveals how systems can make monstrous outcomes seem like reasonable procedures. As Zygmunt Bauman observed in Modernity and the Holocaust, the same bureaucratic efficiency that produces modern conveniences can, when directed toward inhuman ends, create unprecedented capacity for systematic cruelty. Darkness in history and politics. The cycle of civilization and destruction throughout history. Societies have followed a recurring pattern: emergence, growth, flourishing, decay, and collapse. Historian Arnold Toynbee identified over 20 distinct civilizations following this trajectory.
The darkness in this pattern lies in its seeming inevitability. The same creative energies that build civilizations contain seeds of their destruction. Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West proposed that cultures, like organisms, follow a life cycle from youth to senescence. Early stages feature creative vitality and authentic cultural expression, while later phases exhibit material excess, cynicism, and spiritual exhaustion. Archaeological evidence suggests that civilizational collapse often involves multiple factors: environmental degradation, social stratification, external pressures, and diminishing returns on complexity. Joseph Tainter argues that societies solve problems by adding layers of complexity, but eventually reach a point where additional complexity yields negative returns. The Roman Empire's fall illustrates this pattern. Early Roman society valued civic virtue, military discipline, and agricultural simplicity. As Rome expanded, wealth concentrated among elites, corruption became systemic, citizenship lost meaning through broad extension, and maintenance costs for infrastructure and military became unsustainable. This cyclical view of history reveals a tragic aspect of human nature: our inability to maintain the balances that sustain complex societies. The very success of civilizations creates conditions that undermine their foundations. Power and its corruptions. Lord Acton's observation that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely finds support across disciplines. Psychological research demonstrates how authority positions actually alter cognitive functioning and moral reasoning. The power paradox identified by Data Keltner shows that individuals often gain leadership positions through prosocial qualities like empathy and cooperation. However, once in power, these same individuals frequently demonstrate diminished empathy, increased entitlement, and ethical compromises. Neurological research suggests that power literally changes brain function, reducing mirror neuron activity related to empathy and increasing activity in reward centers when subjects contemplate dominant positions. Historically, even leaders beginning with reformist ideals often descend into tyranny. The French Revolution's progression from liberation to the Reign of Terror, or the transformation of revolutionary movements into oppressive regimes in Russia, China, and numerous other contexts, demonstrates this pattern. What makes this aspect of darkness particularly troubling is how structures of power corrupt, not just the corrupt, but the initially virtuous. Systems of authority appear to transform their occupants, regardless of initial character. Michel Foucault's analysis of power reveals its insidious nature: not merely a top-down force, but a network of relations permeating society through institutions, discourses, and practices that shape individuals into governed subjects. Ideology and mass delusion. The 20th century witnessed unprecedented atrocities justified by totalizing ideologies, comprehensive worldviews promising utopian futures through revolutionary transformation. Whether fascism, communism, or other extremist visions, these systems share common features: historical determinism, belief in inevitable historical progression, identification of enemies obstructing progress, willingness to sacrifice present generations for future perfection, rejection of traditional moral constraints, subordination of individual rights to collective goals. Hannah Arendt observed that totalitarian ideologies create fictitious worlds where complex reality is reduced to simplistic narratives of struggle against enemy. These narratives, once accepted, make atrocities appear logical or necessary steps toward ultimate good. Václav Havel, writing under Soviet domination, described how ideological systems compel citizens to live within a lie, publicly affirming what they privately. This mass participation in falsehood corrupts not just politics but language and thought itself. Eric Hoffer's analysis of true believers reveals how extremist movements attract followers by offering certainty, purpose, and identity to those struggling with alienation or insignificance. The fanaticism that enables mass violence stems not from inherent cruelty, but from desperate desire for meaning and belonging. The darkness here lies in humanity's vulnerability to simplistic explanations and utopian promises, our willingness to suspend critical thinking and moral intuition when offered coherent narratives that explain suffering and promise redemption. Darkness in theology and mythology. The problem of evil. Religious traditions have long struggled with the problem of the Odyssey, reconciling divine goodness with the existence of evil and suffering. This tension has produced some of humanity's most profound spiritual reflections. The Book of Job, in the Hebrew Bible, presents perhaps the oldest sustained meditation on this question. Job, A righteous man suffers devastating losses not as punishment for sin but as part of a cosmic wager between God and Satan. Job's demand for explanation receives not a logical answer, but a demonstration of divine mystery transcending human understanding. Augustine proposed that evil results from the misuse of free will. God grants freedom as a supreme good, which necessarily includes the possibility of choosing wrongly. Evil represents not God's failure but the necessary risk of creating beings capable of authentic love. Eastern traditions offer different perspectives. In Buddhism, suffering arises from attachment and ignorance rather than moral. The apparent darkness of existence stems from misunderstanding reality's impermanent nature. Hindu cosmology embraces cycles of creation and destruction, with destructive deities like Shiva recognized as necessary aspects of cosmic order. What appears as darkness from limited human perspective forms part of a larger pattern beyond comprehension. Modern theological responses include process theology, which envisions God as evolving with creation rather than controlling it omnipotently, and theological non-realism, which interprets religious language symbolically rather than metaphysically. The persistence of the problem of evil reveals a fundamental tension in human experience. Our intuitive sense that reality should be just and merciful confronting evidence that it often is not. Mythological representations of darkness across cultures. Myths have personified darkness through archetypal figures embodying shadow aspects of human experience. The trickster appears in numerous traditions: Loki in Norse mythology, Coyote in Native American stories, Hermes in Greek legends. These figures represent disruption of social order, challenging boundaries and revealing hypocrisy. Their moral ambiguity, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, illustrates how chaos can be both destructive and necessary for growth. The devouring mother archetype, appearing as Kali in Hindu tradition or various witch figures in European folklore, represents the destructive aspect of the feminine principle, the necessary dissolution that precedes rebirth. Underworld journeys feature prominently across mythologies: Orpheus seeking Eurydice, Inanna descending to her sister's realm, Christ's harrowing of hell. These narratives suggest encountering darkness is necessary for transformation and wisdom. Jung interpreted these mythological patterns as expressions of psychological realities, the collective unconscious manifesting universal human experiences through symbolic language. The darkness in myth represents not merely external evil but aspects of psyche requiring integration. Joseph Campbell's analysis of the hero's journey reveals how confrontation with shadow forces, dragons, demons, or dark lords, symbolizes the essential psychological task of confronting and integrating disowned aspects of self. What makes mythological darkness particularly significant is its nuanced treatment compared to strict moral dualism. Mythic traditions often recognize destruction as part of creative cycles and darkness as containing wisdom inaccessible to daylight consciousness. Original sin and human fallenness. The Christian doctrine of original sin proposes that humanity exists in a fundamentally broken state, not merely committing individual transgressions but inheriting a corrupted nature. This concept profoundly influenced Western understanding of human darkness. Augustine developed this doctrine from Paul's writings, particularly Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. This perspective suggests our darkest impulses arise not from circumstance or choice alone but from an inherent disposition towards self-centeredness. Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian realism built on this concept, arguing that progressive political movements failed by underestimating humanity's capacity for selfishness and self-deception. Eastern Orthodox Christianity offers a nuanced variety, emphasizing humanity's creation in divine image but subsequent ancestral sin creating propensity toward missing the mark. The focus becomes less inherited guilt and more inherited wound requiring healing. Secular variations of this concept appear in evolutionary psychology, which identifies selfishness as adaptively advantageous in prehistoric environments, and philosophical pessimism, which views human nature as fundamentally flawed rather than perfectible.
Even political systems officially rejecting religious concepts often adopt structural equivalents. Revolutionary movements frequently attribute social problems to bourgeois mentality or false consciousness, requiring systematic re-education or purging. The persistence of this concept across diverse cultures suggests it addresses something recognizable in human experience: our consistent failure to live according to our highest values and our recurrent tendency towards self-justification. Literary and artistic explorations. Heart of Darkness. The journey inward. Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness presents one of literature's most compelling explorations of human capacity for moral dissolution. The narrator Marlowe's journey up the Congo River becomes simultaneously a geographical expedition and psychological descent. The character Kurtz embodies civilization's fragility, a European idealist who, removed from social constraints, transforms into a brutal demigod presiding over human sacrifices. His famous final words, the horror, suggest recognition of darkness, not merely in colonial exploitation, but in human nature itself. Conrad's genius lies in connecting imperial brutality with universal human potential. Marlowe observes the mind of man is capable of anything, because everything is in it, all the past as well as all the future. This perspective challenges comfortable assumptions about moral progress. The darkness Conrad explores exists not merely in colonial Africa, but in European capitals, the heart of an immense darkness, where exploitation is sanitized through bureaucracy and distance. The novella suggests civilization itself may be a thin veneer concealing savage impulses. When social restraints weaken, these impulses emerge with terrifying rapidity. Yet Conrad offers no simple condemnation. Marlowe maintains ambivalence, recognizing how easily he might have followed Kurtz's path. Through literature, Conrad achieves what philosophical exposition cannot, placing readers experientially within moral ambiguity, forcing confrontation with uncomfortable recognitions about their own potential for darkness. Dostoevsky and the freedom to choose evil. Fyodor Dostoevsky's novels explore human darkness with unparalleled psychological depth. Having faced execution, later commuted for political activities, Dostoevsky developed profound insight into how ideology enables cruelty. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov justifies murder through abstract reasoning, believing exceptional individuals stand beyond conventional morality. His subsequent psychological disintegration reveals the impossibility of escaping conscience through intellectual rationalization. The Brothers Karamazov presents Ivan's famous rebellion against divine justice through the Grand Inquisitor parable, arguing that human freedom inevitably leads to suffering, making God's gift of choice a cruel burden rather than blessing. Dostoevsky's characters frequently act against self-interest, deliberately choosing self-destruction over conformity. The underground man declares, "What man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost, and wherever it may lead." This insistence on freedom, even freedom to choose evil, reveals a darkness beyond mere animal impulse. Humans uniquely possess capacity for deliberate perversity, choosing harmful actions precisely because they are harmful, asserting existence beyond rational calculation. Unlike deterministic views reducing evil to environmental or psychological causes, Dostoevsky insists on the reality of genuine moral choice, a perspective that preserves human dignity while acknowledging terrible responsibility. Tragic vision in Shakespeare. William Shakespeare's tragedies present unflinching examinations of human darkness through characters embodying particular aspects of shadow. Macbeth explores how ambition corrupts moral character. Beginning as a loyal warrior, Macbeth transforms into a tyrant through incremental moral compromises. Lady Macbeth's famous invocation, "Unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe-top fullet," of direst cruelty, reveals the deliberate rejection of compassion necessary for certain forms of evil. King Lear depicts how flattery and self-deception lead to catastrophe. Lear's narcissistic demand for declarations of love, and his rage when Cordelia refuses inauthentic expression, initiates a sequence of events stripping away social pretense to reveal raw human nature. Unaccommodated man, no more but such a poor bare forked animal. Othello examines jealousy's destructive power and vulnerability to manipulation. Iago's famous line, "I am not what I am," encapsulates the capacity for deliberate deception central to human darkness. Shakespeare's tragic vision emphasizes both individual responsibility and contextual factors. Its Hello exiles are characters make choices but within circumstances manipulating their particular weaknesses. This balanced perspective avoids both absolute condemnation and deterministic excuse. What emerges across Shakespeare's work is recognition of human greatness inseparable from capacity for disaster, the same qualities enabling transcendent achievement. Ambition, passion, conviction contain seeds of destruction when unbalanced. Modern manifestations of darkness. Technological amplification. Technology extends human capacities for creation and destruction alike. Modern weaponry transforms ancient aggressive impulses into capacity for unprecedented harm, from nuclear arsenals to biological agents capable of pandemic spread. Less obviously, information technology amplifies cognitive biases and tribal instincts. Social media algorithms optimize for engagement, which psychological research shows occurs most reliably through outrage and polarization. Ancient tribal instincts, evolved for small group cohesion, now operate in global information environments, creating what Jonathan Haidt calls structural stupidity, even among intelligent individuals. Neil Postman warned that technologies are not merely tools but environments that restructure thinking. Digital communication privileges immediate emotional response over reflective consideration, potentially undermining capacities essential for democratic governance. Artificial intelligence presents novel manifestations of human darkness, not through malevolent consciousness, but by amplifying and autonomously executing patterns present in training data, including historical biases and exploitative tendencies. Surveillance technologies create unprecedented capacity for social control, potentially enabling what Shoshana Zuboff terms instrumentarian power, modification of behavior through continuous monitoring and feedback without need for conventional coercion. The darkness here lies not in technology itself but in how it interfaces with existing human tendencies, removing friction that previously limited their expression or impact. Alienation and meaninglessness. Modern industrial society produces material abundance but often at cost of meaningful connection and purpose. Sociologist Emil Durkheim identified anomie, normlessness resulting from rapid social change, as driving increased suicide rates during periods of economic transformation. Traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, connection to place, have weakened without adequate replacement. Work increasingly emphasizes productivity over craftsmanship, consumption over creation, abstracted value over tangible contribution. Viktor Frankl, surviving Nazi concentration camps, concluded that meaning deprivation constitutes the central crisis of modernity. The existential vacuum is a widespread phenomenon of the 20th century. When meaning fades, nihilistic despair or fanaticism often fill the void. Consumer culture offers temporary distractions but struggles to provide enduring purpose. As philosopher Charles Taylor observes, modern emphasis on individual fulfillment paradoxically increases sense of isolation. The buffered self lacks transcendent connection that historically provided meaning. This spiritual malaise manifests in rising rates of depression, addiction and extremism, different responses to the same underlying absence. The darkness here is not dramatic evil but quiet desperation, lives devoid of purpose beyond material acquisition and distraction. Environmental destruction. Humanity's relationship with natural systems reveals a particular form of darkness, not deliberate cruelty, but lethal short-sightedness. Despite growing scientific understanding of ecological interconnection, economic systems continue prioritizing immediate extraction over sustainable flourishing. The cognitive limitations evolved for immediate threats and opportunities struggle with gradually unfolding planetary processes. We respond vigorously to dramatic dangers but remain largely unmoved by statistical projections of future harm. Environmental philosopher Timothy Morton describes ecological crisis as a hyperobject, a phenomenon so massively distributed across time and space that it exceeds conventional comprehension. Our conceptual frameworks, evolved for immediate threats and local resources, struggle with planetary-scale challenges. Deep ecology proponents argue that environmental crisis stems from anthropocentrism, placing human concerns absolutely above other life forms. This philosophical stance enables treating nature as mere resource rather than intrinsically valuable system, upon which we ultimately depend. Indigenous perspectives often emphasize how colonial worldviews severed connection between human communities and natural systems. The technological capacity to extract resources industrially combined with philosophical frameworks justifying unlimited use created unprecedented capacity for environmental harm. The darkness in this area lies in our species' apparent inability to restrain consumption despite intellectual recognition of consequences, a collective failure of self-regulation potentially threatening civilization's continued existence. Transcending darkness. Integration rather than suppression. Carl Jung proposed that psychological health requires not elimination of darkness, but its conscious integration. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote.
but by making the darkness conscious. Shadow integration involves acknowledging disowned aspects of self without either indulging or suppressing them. Through conscious relationship with shadow elements, their energy becomes available for constructive purposes rather than emerging in distorted forms. This perspective suggests evil results not from embracing darkness but from denying it, creating unconscious compensatory behaviors more destructive than acknowledged shadow. The person claiming absolute purity often harbors greater darkness than one acknowledging human complexity. Eastern traditions offer parallel insights through practices
Meaning, Death, and the ABS, Facing the Ultimate Questions Introduction. Welcome to what might be the most important conversation you'll ever have. I'm Your Name, and today we're confronting the questions that haunt every human life, questions most of us spend our lives avoiding. What gives life meaning in the face of certain death? How do we stare into the abyss of non-existence and still find the courage to live authentically? Is there purpose in a potentially godless universe? Or are we just sophisticated animals desperately creating illusions to avoid despair? These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They're the questions that wake you at 3 a.m. when the distractions fall away. They're the thoughts that flash through your mind during quiet moments alone. They're the fundamental anxieties that shape how you live, whether you acknowledge them or not. By the end of our journey today, you won't have easy answers, because there aren't any, but you will have something perhaps more valuable: a clear-eyed understanding of what's at stake in how you choose to live, and intellectual tools to craft meaning in a world that doesn't provide it ready-made. So take a deep breath, turn off your notifications. This isn't content you scroll through mindlessly. This is an encounter with the fundamental condition of being human. Let's begin. The search for meaning, the fundamental question: why should I not kill myself? This isn't just a morbid thought experiment. It's philosophy's most basic question, as Albert Camus recognized. Before we can meaningfully discuss how to live, we need to establish why we should live at all. In a universe that appears indifferent to our existence, where we're guaranteed to suffer and then die, what justifies continuing? The question of meaning isn't a luxury for those with time on their hands. It's the prerequisite for any authentic human life. Without addressing it, we're just going through motions we've inherited, living scripts written by others, distracting ourselves from the weight of existence. The search for meaning is particularly acute in our current historical moment. Traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, clear social roles have eroded for many. We live in what sociologists call a disenchanted world, where scientific explanations have replaced mythic ones, where the sacred has retreated, where we're told we're just complex arrangements of atoms governed by impersonal physical laws. Yet the hunger for meaning persists. Perhaps it's wired into us. Perhaps it's an evolutionary adaptation that made our ancestors more successful. Or perhaps it points to something deeper about reality itself, that meaning isn't just something we project onto an indifferent universe, but something we discover about its fundamental nature. Historical sources of meaning throughout human history. Different civilizations have found meaning in different ways. Let's explore some of these approaches, not as museum pieces, but as living options that still speak to us today. In ancient Greece, meaning was often found in the pursuit of excellence or virtue, what they called arete. For Aristotle, the good life consisted of developing your uniquely human capacities to their fullest potential. Living well meant becoming fully what you are capable of becoming. In traditional religious frameworks, from Christianity to Islam to Hinduism, meaning comes from proper relationship with the divine. Human life has a teleology, an inherent purpose designed by a creator. Our task is to align ourselves with this cosmic purpose through worship, moral action, and spiritual practice. Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Taoism often locate meaning in acceptance rather than achievement. The meaningful life comes from releasing attachment, aligning with the natural flow of reality, and transcending the ego that causes suffering through its constant demands. Enlightenment thinking placed reason at the center, suggesting that meaning comes from using our rational capacities to understand the universe and improve the human condition. Progress became a source of meaning, the sense that we're collectively building towards something better. In the modern period, political ideologies provided powerful meaning systems. Whether communism, liberal democracy, or nationalism, these frameworks gave individuals a sense of participating in something larger than themselves, a historical project that transcended their individual lives. None of these historical meaning systems has disappeared entirely. They persist in our cultural memory, offering resources we can draw upon. But for many, they no longer command automatic allegiance. We find ourselves forced to choose, to construct meaning, rather than simply receiving it from our cultural context. The crisis of meaning. In modernity, Friedrich Nietzsche diagnosed our modern condition with brutal clarity when he wrote that God is dead, not making a theological claim, but a cultural one. The grounding principle that had organized Western civilization for centuries had collapsed, leaving an empty space nothing had adequately filled. Without this organizing principle, we faced what existentialists would later call the abyss, the vertiginous freedom of having to create meaning in a universe that doesn't provide it. For many, this freedom is more terrifying than liberating. Easier to fill the void with consumption, distraction, and small pleasures than to confront the task of creating meaning. Ex nihilo. Modernity offers unprecedented individual freedom alongside unprecedented meaninglessness. We can be anyone, do anything, and that boundless possibility creates a paralysis of choice, a sense that no particular path has any claim on us. Meanwhile, our economic system requires us to convert our time into money, our attention into a marketable commodity. Capitalism doesn't just sell products, it sells lifestyles, identities, and meaning substitutes. Want meaning? There's an app for that, a course, a retreat, a brand identity that promises to fill the void. Technology accelerates this process. Social media offers perpetual distraction from confronting deeper questions. The attention economy fragments our consciousness into digestible bits, making sustained engagement with life's fundamental questions nearly impossible for many. The result is what philosophers call alienation, a pervasive sense of disconnect from ourselves, others, nature, and any larger purpose. We live in the most materially abundant societies in human history, yet depression, anxiety, and suicide rates continue to climb. Material prosperity hasn't translated into existential well-being. Contemporary approaches to meaning. How do people find meaning today, in this fragmented landscape? There's no single answer, but several patterns emerge. Some double down on traditional religious frameworks, finding certainty and purpose in ancient wisdom traditions. The resurgence of religious fundamentalism worldwide isn't just about politics, it's a response to the existential vacuum of secular modernity. Others embrace what philosopher Charles Taylor calls expressive individualism, the idea that meaning comes from authentic self-expression and personal fulfillment. Follow your passion becomes a secular commandment. The meaningful life is one where you become who you truly are. Still others find meaning in commitment to causes larger than themselves, social justice, environmental activism, scientific progress. These secular purposes provide a sense of contributing to something that will outlast the individual. Relationships remain a profound source of meaning for many. Love, friendship, family, these connections give life purpose even when abstract meaning systems fail. As the poet W. H. Auden wrote, "We must love one another or die." Finally, some embrace a kind of stoic acceptance of life's inherent meaninglessness, finding a paradoxical peace in letting go of the demand for cosmic significance. This view, articulated powerfully by Albert Camus, suggests that the struggle itself is enough to fill a human heart. These contemporary approaches aren't mutually exclusive. Many people cobble together meaning from multiple sources, creating personalized frameworks rather than adhering to comprehensive systems. This bricolage approach reflects our times, fluid, individualized, pragmatic rather than dogmatic. Meaning as narrative. One helpful way to understand meaning is through the concept of narrative. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We experience our lives not just as sequences of events, but as coherent stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. Meaning arises when we can place ourselves within a larger narrative that makes sense of our experiences. This narrative doesn't have to be religious or cosmic. It can be about family legacy, contribution to community, or personal growth. But without some narrative framework, experiences become disconnected, random, meaningless. Psychologist Dan McAdams calls this narrative identity, the internalized, evolving story we tell about ourselves. Research suggests that people with coherent life narratives tend to report greater well-being and sense of purpose than those whose life stories are fragmented or lack direction. But narratives require endings to give them shape and meaning. This brings us to our next topic, the ultimate end that gives human life its tragic character and its urgency: death. Confronting death. The central fact every human enterprise unfolds in the shadow of a simple biological fact: we will die. No technology, wealth, or achievement changes this fundamental truth. Death is the universal human destination, yet our relationship to this fact is complex and contradictory. We know we will die, but most of us live as if we won't. We're aware of our mortality intellectually, but repress this awareness emotionally. As Freud observed, the unconscious mind cannot imagine its own death. This creates what philosophers call bad faith, a kind of self-deception, where we both know and don't know the central fact of our existence. We make long-term plans while forgetting the fragility of life. We waste precious time as if we had an infinite supply. Death isn't just an event at the end of life, it's a presence that shapes everything that precedes it. The philosopher Martin Heidegger used the term being toward death to describe authentic human existence, living with clear awareness that death is not just something that happens to us eventually, but an integral part of what it means to be human. Death anxiety and denial terror of death runs deep in the human psyche. Ernest Becker's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, argues that this terror drives much of human culture. Our achievements, beliefs, and social systems serve largely as elaborate defense mechanisms against awareness of our mortality. Terror management theory, a psychological framework inspired by Becker's work, has found experimental support for this view. When subtly reminded of their mortality, people cling more fiercely to their cultural worldviews, react more negatively to those who threaten those worldviews, and pursue symbolic immortality through identification with enduring groups and causes. Our culture offers countless strategies for denying death. Consumer capitalism keeps us perpetually focused on the next purchase, the next experience, the next upgrade, always future-oriented, never dwelling on finitude. Anti-aging industries promise to push death further away through medicine, supplements, and technologies. Digital legacy services offer to maintain our online presence after death, blurring the boundary between presence and absence. More radically, transhumanist movements like longevity research and cryonics seek technological solutions to death itself. Some predict a longevity escape velocity, where medical advances outpace aging, effectively creating immortality for those with access to these technologies. These approaches share a common thread: they treat death as a technical problem to be solved rather than an existential reality to be confronted. They offer the comfort of action over the difficulty of acceptance. Philosophical approaches to death. Philosophy has long grappled with how we should relate to death. Different traditions offer strikingly different perspectives. Epicurus famously argued that death is nothing to us. His reasoning was straightforward: when death is present, we are absent, and when we are present, death is absent. Since we never experience our own non-existence, why fear it? This rational approach attempts to disarm death anxiety through logical analysis. The Stoics took a different approach, advocating memento mori, the practice of remembering death. By keeping death continually in mind, they believed we would value our time properly and focus on what truly matters. Death becomes not something to fear but a clarifying force that strips away trivial concerns. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre saw death as the ultimate absurdity that both gives life its urgency and renders it potentially meaningless. Death makes every project questionable. Why build when all will be swept away? Yet also creates the imperative to choose and act authentically in the time we have. Heidegger viewed confrontation with death as essential to authentic existence. Only by acknowledging our finite nature can we take responsibility for our lives and make choices that express our true possibilities, rather than following conventional paths. East Asian philosophical traditions often approach death differently. In Zen Buddhism, meditation on death isn't intended to provoke anxiety, but to dissolve the illusion of a separate, permanent self. When the self is recognized as fundamentally impermanent and interconnected, death loses its sting. Psychological impacts of mortality awareness. How does awareness of death affect us psychologically? The research suggests complex, sometimes contradictory effects. Mortality salience. Being reminded of death often initially produces anxiety, defensiveness, and stronger attachment to cultural worldviews that promise symbolic immortality. We become more tribal,
more dogmatic, more likely to demonize outgroups. But more sustained confrontation with mortality can produce profound positive transformations. Cancer survivors and others who've faced death often report greater appreciation for life, clearer priorities, reduced materialism, and enhanced ability to live in the present. Psychologist Irvin Yalom, who has worked extensively with terminally ill patients, finds that confronting death often leads to what he calls an awakening experience, where life becomes more vivid, authentic relationships deepen, and petty concerns fall away. This pattern, initial terror followed by potential growth, suggests that our first defensive response to death isn't necessarily our final or most mature response. The challenge is moving beyond denial and terror to a relationship with mortality that enhances rather than diminishes life. Death and meaning. The connection. Death and meaning are intimately connected. Death creates the scarcity that makes our choices significant. In a hypothetical immortal existence, any action could be indefinitely postponed, any mistake eventually corrected, any path eventually taken. Nothing would have urgency or weight. Our mortality creates what philosophers call finitude, the limited nature of human existence in terms of time, knowledge, and perspective. This finitude is the condition that makes meaning possible. Because we cannot do everything, be everyone, or know everything, our choices matter. Death also forces us to consider what outlasts us, the legacy we leave, the impact we have on others, the causes we contribute to. Many find meaning precisely in what transcends their individual existence, whether through family lineage, creative works, contributions to human knowledge, or participation in enduring traditions. Perhaps most profoundly, awareness of death can awaken us to the preciousness of life. When we truly grasp that our time is finite, each moment takes on new significance. As the Zen saying goes, the bird of paradise alights only upon the hand that does not grasp. Meaning emerges not from desperate clinging to life, but from fully experiencing its transient beauty. This brings us to the third element of our exploration, the abyss. That sense of groundlessness that emerges when we confront both the human need for meaning and the reality of death. Facing the abyss. What is the abyss? The abyss is not just a poetic metaphor but a concrete existential experience, that vertiginous sensation when the frameworks that give life meaning suddenly seem fragile or arbitrary. It's the void we sense beneath our carefully constructed lives, the groundlessness we feel when certainties collapse. Friedrich Nietzsche captured this experience when he wrote, "If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." When we deeply question the foundations of meaning, something in us can unravel. The comfortable illusions that sustain daily life become transparent, revealing the contingency of everything we take for granted. This experience has many names across traditions. Existentialists call it angst or existential dread. Religious traditions might name it the dark night of the soul. Psychiatry sometimes labels it existential depression or aspects of depersonalization. Whatever we call it, this confrontation with ultimate groundlessness seems to be an inescapable part of human consciousness. Our meaning-making capacities, that give life richness and purpose, also enable us to question those very meanings, to see through them, to stand outside them. The experience of nihilism. When the abyss overwhelms our meaning-making capacities, we experience nihilism, the sense that nothing ultimately matters, that all values are arbitrary, all purposes futile. Nihilism isn't just a philosophical position, it's a lived experience of meaninglessness that can be profoundly disorienting. Fyodor Dostoevsky explored nihilism's psychological terrain in novels like The Brothers Karamazov, where he famously suggested that, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Without a transcendent grounding for values, how can any action be meaningful rather than arbitrary? Nihilism manifests differently across individuals and cultures. Sometimes it appears as profound apathy, why bother with anything if nothing ultimately? Sometimes as hedonism, if life has no intrinsic meaning, why not maximize pleasure? Sometimes as despair, a crushing sense that all human endeavor is ultimately futile. In our contemporary world, nihilism often takes subtle forms. The endless scroll of social media, binge consumption of entertainment, and pursuit of numbing pleasures, can all be ways of avoiding the abyss rather than confronting it. If nothing matters, distraction becomes a logical response. but these avoidance strategies exact a cost. Research on experiential avoidance suggests that attempting to escape uncomfortable existential emotions leads to diminished psychological well-being over time. The abyss doesn't disappear when ignored, it merely exerts its influence unconsciously. Existential strategies for facing the abyss. How, then, do we face the abyss without being consumed by it? Existentialist philosophers offer several approaches. Søren Kierkegaard proposed what he called the leap of faith, a commitment to meaning that acknowledges its groundlessness, yet embraces it anyway. This isn't blind faith, but a choice made with full awareness of its contingency, what he called the teleological suspension of the ethical. Jean-Paul Sartre emphasized radical freedom and responsibility. Confronting the abyss reveals that we are not determined by external factors, but must create ourselves, through our choices. This is simultaneously terrifying and liberating. We are condemned to be free, forced to create meaning in a world that doesn't provide it. Albert Camus offered the metaphor of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, repeating this task for eternity. Camus saw this as a metaphor for the human condition, objectively absurd, yet potentially meaningful through our attitude toward it. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, he famously concluded. Simone de Beauvoir focused on freedom not as isolated individual choice, but as a shared human project. The abyss of meaninglessness is countered not by solitary heroism, but by mutual recognition and solidarity. We create meaning together through our projects and relationships. Martin Heidegger suggested a response to groundlessness through what he called releasement, Gelassenheit, neither clinging desperately to meanings nor surrendering to nihilism, but developing a receptive attention to being itself. Rather than imposing meaning on existence, we learn to listen to what existence reveals. Resilience and post-traumatic growth psychological research offers insights complementary to these philosophical approaches. Studies on resilience and post-traumatic growth suggest that confronting existential challenges can lead not just to recovery, but to transformation. Resilience isn't about avoiding difficulty, but developing the capacity to face it without being destroyed. This involves what psychologist Susan Folkman calls meaning-focused coping, the ability to find or create meaning even in objectively terrible circumstances. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, developed partly from his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, proposes that humans can endure almost anyhow, if they have a sufficient why. Even in circumstances of extreme suffering, the capacity to find meaning makes survival possible. Post-traumatic growth research finds that many people who experience severe trauma report positive psychological changes alongside their suffering, deeper relationships, greater appreciation for life, enhanced personal strength, spiritual development, and recognition of new possibilities. These findings suggest that confronting the abyss, whether through philosophical questioning or traumatic life events, doesn't necessarily end in nihilism. The very groundlessness that threatens meaning can become the condition for a more authentic chosen meaning to emerge. The abyss as transformative. What if the abyss isn't simply a threat to meaning, but a necessary passage to deeper meaning? Many wisdom traditions suggest precisely this paradoxical possibility. In Zen Buddhism, the experience of sunyata, emptiness, initially appears as a frightening void, but ultimately reveals itself as the ground of compassion and freedom. When fixed meanings dissolve, a more flexible and responsive engagement with life becomes possible. Christian mystical theology speaks of the cloud of unknowing and the dark night of the soul, stages where familiar religious concepts and experiences fall away, creating a painful sense of abandonment that paradoxically opens the way to more direct spiritual experience. Jungian psychology describes the confrontation with the shadow and the dissolution of the persona as necessary steps toward individuation. What initially appears as a threatening void reveals itself as the space where a more authentic self can emerge. Contemporary dissonance researchers, like John Vivaldi, speak of the meaning crisis not as a problem to be solved, but as a developmental challenge that potentially leads to more sophisticated ways of making meaning, moving from rigid meaning frameworks to more fluid, context-sensitive, embodied ways of finding significance. These diverse traditions converge on a counterintuitive insight. The abyss that threatens to destroy meaning is also the condition for more authentic meaning. The groundlessness we fear may be precisely what we need to encounter. Integrating meaning, death, and the abyss, the triad of human existence. We've explored meaning, death, and the abyss as separate topics, but in lived experience, they form an integrated whole, a triad that defines the human condition. Let's now consider how these elements relate to each other and what this integrated perspective offers. Meaning emerges as our response to both death and the abyss. Awareness of mortality gives our choices weight and urgency. Confrontation with the abyss reveals the constructed nature of meaning, while simultaneously calling forth our meaning-making capacities. Death functions as both destroyer and clarifier of meaning. It threatens to render all projects futile, yet also strips away trivial concerns, revealing what truly matters. The finitude death imposes creates the scarcity that makes our time precious. The abyss reveals the groundlessness of our meaning systems, yet also creates the space where more authentic meanings can emerge. It destroys fixed certainties but opens possibilities for chosen commitment and creative response. This triad isn't a problem to be solved, but the fundamental structure of human existence. Each element needs the others. Meaning without awareness of death becomes shallow. Death without meaning-making capacity becomes mere biological fact. The abyss without creative response leads to paralysis. Living with uncertainty. One key to integrating this existential triad is developing the capacity to live with fundamental uncertainty. Not just ordinary uncertainty about particular facts or outcomes, but radical uncertainty about the biggest questions. Why are we here? What happens after death? Is there purpose to existence? Modern culture often treats uncertainty as a temporary state to be resolved through more information or better analysis. But existential uncertainty isn't like this. It persists despite our best knowledge-gathering efforts. No amount of scientific progress will definitively answer whether life has inherent meaning or purpose. The capacity to hold this uncertainty without rushing to premature closure or collapsing into nihilism may be one of the most important psychological skills we can develop. It requires what psychologists call tolerance of ambiguity and what philosophers might call intellectual humility. This doesn't mean abandoning the search for truth or suspending all judgment. It means recognizing the provisional nature of our frameworks, holding them lightly that they can evolve, while firmly enough that they can guide action. Various contemplative traditions offer practices for cultivating this capacity. Meditation techniques that develop non-reactive awareness, philosophical exercises that question assumptions, creative processes that engage with mystery rather than trying to eliminate it. Authenticity and commitment. Another key to integration lies in the twin virtues of authenticity and commitment. Authenticity involves honest recognition of our existential situation, acknowledging death, meaning's constructed nature, and the ever-present abyss. Commitment involves choosing meanings and values despite their lack of absolute foundation. These virtues can seem contradictory. How can we commit wholeheartedly to meanings we recognize as constructed rather than discovered? How can we invest in projects that death will eventually erase? Existentialist philosophers suggest that authentic commitment isn't despite uncertainty, but because of it. When we recognize that no external authority can tell us what matters, that we must choose our values rather than deriving them from tradition, nature, or divinity, our commitments become more truly our own. As Camus wrote, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because his task has objective meaning, but because he embraces it fully despite its objective absurdity. The very groundlessness that threatens meaning becomes the condition for chosen meaning. This integration of authenticity and commitment manifests differently across individuals. For some it appears as dedication to social causes despite recognition of their historical contingency. For others, as religious faith that acknowledges doubt as integral rather than opposed to belief. For still others, as immersion in creative or intellectual pursuits with full awareness of their transience. What unites these diverse expressions is the refusal of bad faith, the refusal to pretend either that our meanings are simply given to us, or that no meaning is possible at all.
Finitude as gift. Perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of integrating our existential triad is recognizing finitude as gift rather than limitation. This perspective suggests that what appears as lack, our limited time, knowledge, and perspective, actually creates the conditions for meaning. Consider time. Because we cannot do everything, we must choose what matters most. Our mortality doesn't just limit our possibilities, it creates the urgency that makes them significant. As poet Mary Oliver asks, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Consider knowledge. Because we cannot know everything with certainty, we must trust, hope, and take intellectual risks. The spaces between what we know create room for faith, religious or secular, for wonder, for the humility that makes learning possible. Consider perspective. Because we cannot see from everywhere at once, we need others whose different viewpoints complement our own. Our limited perspective creates the conditions for genuine relationship, not just using others to confirm what we already think, but learning from their different experiences. This reframing of finitude doesn't deny death's tragedy or the abyss's disorientation. Rather, it suggests that what makes human existence vulnerable also makes it valuable. The very qualities that expose us to suffering and uncertainty also enable love, creativity, and meaning. Tragic optimism. Viktor Frankl coined the term tragic optimism to describe an attitude that affirms life's meaning despite suffering, guilt, and death. This perspective doesn't deny life's tragic dimensions, but finds possibility within them. Tragic optimism differs from naive positivity that ignores suffering or stoic resignation that merely endures it. It acknowledges the full weight of human tragedy while maintaining that meaning remains possible, not despite tragedy, but sometimes through it. This attitude appears across wisdom traditions. In Christianity, the crucifixion precedes resurrection. In Buddhism, the recognition of suffering opens the path to liberation. In Greek tragedy, the hero's downfall reveals human dignity even in failure. Contemporary positive psychology, particularly as developed by researchers like Jonathan Haidt and Paul Wong, has begun to incorporate this tragic dimension, moving beyond simplistic happiness theories to explore how meaning emerges through engagement with life's difficulties. Tragic optimism offers a framework for integrating meaning, death, and the abyss without denying any element of the triad. It embraces the project of meaning-making while acknowledging its inevitable incompleteness. It confronts death without being paralyzed by it. It peers into the abyss while choosing to create rather than merely despair. Practical wisdom for the journey. Practices for meaning-making. How do we translate these philosophical insights into lived experience? What practices help us navigate the existential terrain we've explored? Let's consider some possibilities, drawn from both traditional wisdom and contemporary research. Narrative practices help us construct coherent life stories that integrate past experiences, present circumstances, and future possibilities. These include journaling, autobiographical reflection, and what psychologists call benefit finding, identifying meaning even in difficult experiences. Research by Dan McAdams suggests that people who develop redemptive sequences in their life stories, narratives where suffering leads to growth or meaning, tend to show greater psychological well-being than those whose narratives lack this integration. Contemplative practices develop our capacity to be present with experiences without immediately judging or reacting to them. Meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative prayer create space for deeper awareness of what matters beneath the stream of ordinary concerns. Studies show that regular meditation practice can reduce existential anxiety and increase sense of meaning, particularly practices that cultivate open awareness rather than narrow concentration. Value clarification exercises help us identify and prioritize what truly matters to us, distinguishing authentic values from internalized expectations. These include structured reflection on what we would regret not doing, how we want to be remembered, or what we stand for. Acceptance and commitment therapy (ACAT) uses such exercises to help people align behavior with core values, finding that this alignment correlates strongly with psychological well-being and sense of purpose. Rituals and ceremonies create symbolic containers for existential transitions, helping us metabolize experiences of loss, change, and uncertainty. These can be religious or secular, cultural or personal, elaborate or simple. Anthropological research shows that rituals help manage anxiety during uncertain times by creating a sense of order and meaning. Creating personal rituals around significant life transitions can serve similar functions for those without traditional religious frameworks. Practices for death awareness. How do we develop a healthier relationship with mortality? Various traditions offer practices specifically focused on death awareness. Memento mori practices involve regular reflection on death's inevitability. The Stoics recommended visualizing your own death daily. Some Buddhist traditions practice meditation in charnel grounds. The Christian tradition of Ash Wednesday reminds worshippers, remember that you are dust and to dust you shall return. Research on mortality salience suggests that regular contemplation of death, when approached mindfully rather than fearfully, can increase appreciation for life, clarify priorities, and reduce attachment to trivial concerns. Death preparation involves practical and psychological readiness for the end of life. This includes concrete steps like advanced directives and ethical wills, as well as emotional preparation through death education and open conversations about mortality. Studies of end-of-life care show that those who have engaged in death preparation tend to experience less distress and more meaning during the dying process than those who have avoided the topic. Grief practices help us metabolize losses, both deaths and other significant endings. These include mourning rituals, memorialization of what's been lost, and intentional integration of loss into ongoing life narrative. Bereavement research indicates that avoiding grief often leads to complicated or prolonged mourning, while practices that honor loss while gradually rebuilding meaning lead to healthier adaptation. Legacy projects involve creating something that will outlast your individual life, whether through creative work, mentoring others, contributing to causes, or strengthening family or community bonds. Research on generativity, concern for future generations, shows that those who develop ways to contribute beyond their lifespan tend to report greater life satisfaction and meaning in later adulthood. Practices for facing the abyss. How do we develop the capacity to face groundlessness without being overwhelmed by it? Several approaches offer guidance. Philosophical inquiry develops our ability to question assumptions and hold contradictions without premature resolution. The ancient Greek practice of aporia, intentionally dwelling in perplexity rather than rushing to answers, builds tolerance for uncertainty. Contemporary philosophical practices like Socratic dialogue groups and philosophical counseling continue this tradition, helping participants develop comfort with questioning fundamental assumptions. Creative engagement with mystery through art, music, poetry, and other expressive forms allows us to dwell in uncertainty without needing to resolve it conceptually. Art often communicates precisely where rational discourse reaches its limits. Research on the psychology of creativity suggests that creative processes involve comfort with ambiguity and openness to experiences that don't fit existing categories, precisely the capacities needed for facing the abyss. Community practices that normalize existential questioning create safe containers for exploring the abyss together rather than in isolation. These range from formal philosophical communities to informal conversations where deep questions are welcomed rather than deflected. Studies of existential isolation, the sense that one's subjective experience is disconnected from others, find that spaces for authentic sharing of existential concerns can significantly reduce this painful sense of separation. Nature immersion offers an embodied experience of being part of something larger than human concerns without requiring specific belief systems. Many report that time in natural settings provides perspective on human-scale problems and connects them to time scales beyond individual life. Research on awe experiences finds that encounters with vast complex phenomena like natural landscapes can reduce self-focus, increase sense of connectedness, and foster comfort with mystery. The role of community. While much of our discussion has focused on individual meaning-making, it's crucial to recognize that facing these existential realities is not meant to be a solitary project. Community plays essential roles in our relationship with meaning, death, and the abyss. Communities provide shared meaning frameworks that support individual meaning-making. Even those who ultimately develop personal philosophies typically do so in dialogue with cultural traditions, not from scratch. Our meanings are always partly inherited, partly created. Communities offer witness to our lives, remembering our stories beyond our individual consciousness. The knowledge that others will remember us after death provides a form of symbolic immortality that can ease death anxiety. Communities create space for authentic vulnerability around existential concerns. When others acknowledge their own struggles with meaning and mortality, we feel less alone in ours. The simple acknowledgement, "I struggle with this too," can be profoundly comforting. Communities provide reality testing for our meaning systems, preventing them from becoming solipsistic or delusional. Healthy communities balance validation of personal meaning with gentle challenge when meaning systems become rigid or harmful. Unfortunately, many contemporary communities lack capacity for existential depth. Consumer culture, entertainment media, and even some religious settings often deflect rather than engage the questions we've explored. Finding or creating communities that welcome existential inquiry may require intentional effort. The Courage to Be theologian Paul Tillich wrote of the courage to be, the willingness to affirm life despite its inherent anxiety and uncertainty.
This courage isn't about eliminating doubt or fear, but about living meaningfully within and through them. The courage to be manifests in different ways across individuals and cultures. For some it appears as quiet persistence in daily responsibilities despite suffering. For others as bold creative or ethical action in the face of opposition. For still others as vulnerable authenticity when it would be easier to hide behind conventions. What unites these manifestations is the refusal to be paralyzed by existential realities. The courageous response to meaning, death, and the abyss is neither denial nor despair, but creative engagement, making something worthwhile from the raw materials of finitude. This courage isn't a personality trait you either have or lack. It's a capacity that can be cultivated through the practices we've discussed and through relationship with exemplars who demonstrate this quality. Perhaps most importantly, the courage to be develops through practice, through small daily choices to engage authentically with life rather than numbing or distracting ourselves. Each time we choose presence over avoidance, we strengthen this capacity.
The nature of power, a philosophical exploration, what drives the world. Behind the curtain of civilization, beyond the visible structures of society, lies something elemental, something both feared and desired. Power. I'm your name, and today we're embarking on a journey to understand the very nature of power itself. Power shapes our relationships, our institutions, and our history. It flows through every interaction, sometimes visible, often invisible. Today we'll peel back the layers to examine what power truly is, how it functions, how it corrupts, and perhaps most importantly, how understanding it might set us free. Before we dive into complex theories, let's ask the fundamental question: what is power? At its core, power is the ability to influence outcomes, to make things happen, to prevent things from happening. It's the capacity to act effectively in the world, and to influence the actions of others. But this simple definition barely scratches the surface. Throughout history, power has worn many faces. The raw physical dominance of ancient warlords, the divine right claimed by kings, the economic leverage held by merchants and industrialists, the subtle influence of cultural icons and thought leaders. In 16th century Florence, a diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli revolutionized our understanding of power with his controversial work, The Prince. Exiled from politics, Machiavelli wrote what many consider the most brutal assessment of political power ever penned. His central insight was revolutionary. Power operates according to its own logic, independent of morality. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Machiavelli advised princes. He argued that rulers who wish to maintain their power must be prepared to act in ways that might seem cruel or dishonest. The successful ruler, according to Machiavelli, understands that power has its own imperatives that transcend conventional morality. What made Machiavelli's work so shocking was not just its content but its unflinching realism. He described power, not as it ought to be, but as it actually operates. He saw that power follows certain principles regardless of who wields it or for what purpose. This realistic understanding of power remains central to modern political thought. Leaders who fail to understand the nature of power, its maintenance, its projection, its limitations, often find themselves outmaneuvered by those who do. Machiavelli's legacy is the understanding that maintaining power requires pragmatism, sometimes at the expense of idealism. But power extends far beyond the political realm. In the 20th century, French philosopher Michel Foucault revolutionized our understanding of power, yet again by showing how it permeates every aspect of society. Foucault's genius was to see power not as something possessed by the few and imposed on the many, but as a complex network of relationships that shapes every aspect of human life. For Foucault, power isn't just what happens when a king issues a decree or a police officer makes an arrest. It's in the architecture of our schools and prisons, designed to monitor and control behavior. It's in the medical definitions of normal and abnormal that determine who receives treatment and who faces stigma. It's in the subtle ways we discipline ourselves to fit social expectations without anyone having to force us. Foucault introduced the concept of power knowledge, the idea that power and knowledge are inseparable. Those who control what counts as legitimate knowledge exercise tremendous power. Think about how medical authorities determine what constitutes mental illness, or how educational institutions decide what subjects are worth teaching. These knowledge frameworks shape our reality in profound ways. Perhaps most unsettling about Foucault's analysis is his insight that power doesn't just repress, it produces. It creates identities, desires, and forms of pleasure. We come to want what power has conditioned us to want. We build our sense of self around categories that power has established. This means resistance isn't as simple as throwing off external constraints. We must recognize how power has shaped our very selves. One of Foucault's most compelling examples is the modern prison system. In earlier eras, punishment was public and physical, designed to make an example of the criminal's body. Modern prisons shifted to surveillance and rehabilitation, focusing on the criminal's soul. This shift wasn't necessarily more humane. It was a different kind of power, aimed at producing docile bodies and normalized subjects. The systems of control and manipulation that shape our world often operate invisibly. Consider how algorithms determine what information we see online, subtly guiding our beliefs and behaviors. Consider how corporate marketing creates artificial needs, making us feel incomplete without certain products. Consider how social media platforms are designed to maximize engagement, regardless of the psychological cost. These systems don't require a central authority issuing commands. They function through distributed networks of incentives, norms, and structures. We participate in them willingly, often unaware of how they shape our choices and desires. This is power at its most effective, when it doesn't need to announce itself as power. Let's engage in a thought experiment. What would you do with total power? Your answer reveals much about your character, your values, and your understanding of power itself. Would you use it to help others, to pursue personal desires, or perhaps to reshape society according to your ideals? And how long would it take before absolute power began to corrupt absolutely? Lord Acton's famous observation that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, points to a fundamental human vulnerability. Studies in psychology consistently show that people given authority over others often begin to view those beneath them as less fully human. The Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how quickly ordinary people can embrace cruelty when given power over others. Yet power isn't inherently corrupting. The critical factor appears to be accountability. Those who must answer for their use of power, who face meaningful consequences for abuses, tend to wield it more responsibly. This explains why democratic systems, for all their flaws, have proven more resistant to extreme abuses than authoritarian regimes. The distribution of power matters tremendously. Concentrated power, even in well-intentioned hands, tends towards self-preservation and expansion. Distributed power, with checks and balances, creates resilience against corruption. This wisdom informed the design of many modern democratic systems which intentionally divide power among competing institutions. Throughout history, those seeking social change have recognized that power rarely yields willingly. Frederick Douglass observed that power concedes nothing without a demand. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that moral appeals alone were insufficient. Pressure had to be applied through organized resistance. These leaders grasped that power responds primarily to countervailing power. The relationship between power and truth is particularly complex. While we often imagine truth speaking to power, the reality is that power shapes what counts as truth in the first place. Consider how economic interests influence scientific research, how political considerations affect media coverage, or how social pressures determine which views can be expressed without penalty. Yet truth remains one of the most potent challenges to abusive power. Whistleblowers risking careers and safety to expose corruption, journalists documenting hidden abuses, historians uncovering suppressed narratives, scientists presenting findings that challenge profitable industries. These acts of truth-telling can undermine illegitimate power, though often at great personal cost. How we exercise the power we have, however limited, reveals our character. Parents have power over children, teachers over students, managers over employees, voters over representatives. Each relationship contains power dynamics that can be wielded with compassion and wisdom, or with self-interest and cruelty. In our personal lives, healthy relationships require balanced power. When one person consistently dominates decision-making, relationships become distorted. The same principle applies in workplaces, communities, and nations. Sustainable power arrangements acknowledge interdependence and mutual vulnerability. Technology has transformed power in the modern world. Nuclear weapons gave nations unprecedented destructive capacity. Mass media allowed messages to reach millions simultaneously. The internet enabled new forms of organization and resistance. Artificial intelligence threatens to concentrate power in the hands of those who control key algorithms and data. Yet for all these technological shifts, the fundamental dynamics of power remain recognizable across history. The desire to influence others, to shape circumstances, to avoid being controlled. These are constants of the human condition. Throughout our exploration, we've seen that power isn't just possessed by the obvious authorities, it flows through networks of relationships, institutions, and technologies. Understanding this helps us recognize how we're shaped by power and how we might reshape it in turn. So what are we to do with these insights? First, we can develop power literacy, the ability to recognize power dynamics in our relationships and institutions. We can ask who benefits from this arrangement, whose voices are amplified, and whose are silenced. What forms of knowledge are privileged, and which are marginalized. Second, we can practice using whatever power we have ethically and effectively. Whether leading a team, raising children, or participating in community decisions, we can choose power with rather than power over, seeking collaboration rather than domination. Third, we can build systems that distribute power more equitably and hold the powerful accountable. This is the work of democracy at its best, creating structures where power serves the common good rather than narrow interests. The nature of power is neither inherently good nor evil. Like fire, it can warm or burn. Like water, it can sustain life or drown it. The question isn't whether power should exist, it always will, but how it should be distributed, limited, and directed. The historical evolution of power. To truly understand power, we must trace its evolution throughout human history. The earliest human societies, small bands of hunter-gatherers, distributed power relatively equally among adult members, with temporary leadership based on skill and experience rather than permanent hierarchy. Anthropological evidence suggests these societies were remarkably egalitarian compared to what would follow. The agricultural revolution around 10,000 BCE fundamentally transformed power structures. As humans settled in permanent communities and accumulated surplus resources, hierarchies emerged. Some individuals gained control over land, food storage, and eventually the labor of others. The seeds of inequality were planted, and with them, new forms of power. Early civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Indus Valley developed increasingly sophisticated systems of centralized authority. Kings and emperors claimed divine mandate, positioning themselves as intermediaries between common people and the gods. Religion thus became one of history's most effective tools for legitimizing power. By linking worldly authority to cosmic order, rulers made questioning their power equivalent to questioning the divine. The invention of writing created another crucial instrument of power. Written legal codes like Hammurabi's allowed rulers to standardize their authority across vast territories. Writing also enabled the development of bureaucracy, systems of administrative control that could function across time and space, extending a ruler's reach far beyond their physical presence. Ancient Greek city-states, particularly Athens, experimented with new forms of power distribution through democratic governance. Though limited to free male citizens, Athenian democracy represented a radical reconception of political power as something that could be shared among equals rather than flowing from a divine ruler. Parallel philosophical traditions questioned the nature of legitimate authority, with thinkers like Plato and Aristotle debating whether power should rest with the wise few or the many. The Roman Empire demonstrated how military might could be translated into lasting political dominance. Rome's genius lay in absorbing conquered peoples into its power structure, offering pathways to citizenship and even leadership roles to former enemies. This inclusivity, combined with brutal suppression of rebellion, allowed Rome to maintain power across 3 continents for centuries. The feudal system that emerged in medieval Europe after Rome's collapse represented yet another power arrangement. Power became explicitly hierarchical and contractual, with obligations flowing in both directions. Lords provided protection while vassals offered service. Land ownership formed the material basis of power, with elaborate ceremonies and oaths providing symbolic reinforcement of these relationships. Religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, established a parallel power structure throughout medieval Europe. At times, religious and secular authorities competed directly, as in the famous confrontation between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in the 11th century. This tension between spiritual and worldly power would shape European history for centuries.
The Renaissance and Reformation periods witnessed critical challenges to traditional sources of authority. Protestant reformers questioned the Church's monopoly on spiritual truth. Scientists and philosophers challenged inherited wisdom. Merchants and bankers accumulated wealth independent of land ownership. These developments gradually undermined the feudal power structure. The Enlightenment brought revolutionary new ideas about the source and limits of power. John Locke argued that legitimate government power derived from the consent of the governed, not divine right. Montesquieu proposed separating powers to prevent tyranny. Rousseau explored the concept of the general will as the proper basis for political authority. These ideas provided intellectual ammunition for the political revolutions that followed. The American and French revolutions attempted to implement Enlightenment principles by establishing governments based on popular sovereignty, rather than monarchical authority. The American system distributed power among competing branches of government, while the French Revolution initially sought more radical equality. Both represented foundational shifts in how power was conceptualized and organized in the modern world. The Industrial Revolution created unprecedented concentrations of economic power. Factory owners controlled not just their workers' labor but often their housing, food supply, and entire communities. This period saw the rise of new ideologies addressing the proper distribution of economic power: capitalism defending private ownership and market freedom, socialism advocating collective control of productive resources. Karl Marx provided the most influential analysis of how economic power shapes society. He argued that control over the means of production constituted the fundamental power relationship, in any era, with other social structures, political systems, cultural institutions, family arrangements, reflecting and reinforcing this basic economic power dynamic. For Marx, history was driven by class struggle, conflicts between those who held economic power and those who did not. The 20th century witnessed experiments with radically different power arrangements. Communist revolutions attempted to redistribute economic and political power from elites to working classes, though in practice they often created new power concentrations in party bureaucracies. Fascist regimes consolidated extreme power in the hands of authoritarian leaders, mobilizing mass support through nationalism and scapegoating. Colonialism represented perhaps the most extensive power system in human history, with European nations exercising control over vast territories and populations across the globe. Colonial power operated through military force, economic extraction, cultural domination, and racial hierarchy. The struggles for independence in the mid-20th century represented a massive reconfiguration of global power relations. The post-World War II era saw the emergence of two competing global power systems during the Cold War, along with international institutions like the United Nations attempting to establish rule-based constraints on power. Decolonization created dozens of new sovereign states, though economic dependency often limited their actual autonomy. Nuclear weapons transformed geopolitical calculations, creating the possibility of mutual destruction. The information revolution of recent decades has reshaped power dynamics yet again. Traditional gatekeepers in media, education, and other fields have lost their monopolies. Network power, the ability to connect and coordinate, has grown in importance relative to hierarchical authority. Social movements can mobilize globally without centralized leadership. Yet new concentrations of power have emerged in tech giants that control crucial digital infrastructure. Throughout this historical evolution, certain patterns become apparent. Power consistently seeks legitimacy. Raw coercion is expensive and unstable, so power holders strive to make their authority seem natural and necessary. Power adapts to changing material conditions, finding new bases as technology and economic systems evolve. And power constantly faces resistance, forcing it to reform or revealing its true coercive nature. Power in personal relationships. While we often think of power in political or economic terms, its most immediate expression occurs in our personal relationships. From families to friendships to romantic partnerships, power dynamics shape our most intimate connections. Understanding these dynamics can help us build healthier relationships and recognize harmful patterns. In parent-child relationships, power is asymmetrical by necessity. Parents make decisions for children who lack the experience and capacity for full autonomy. But healthy parenting involves a gradual transfer of power as children develop from total dependence to guided independence to eventual autonomy. Parents who cling to control beyond appropriate developmental stages or who abdicate responsibility prematurely both create dysfunctional power dynamics. French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan identified the father figure as representing what he called the law, the authority that separates the child from complete union with the mother and introduces them to societal rules and limitations. This paternal function represents the child's first encounter with external authority and shapes their later relationship to power. Family systems often develop implicit power hierarchies that may not reflect formal roles. The person who controls financial resources may hold practical power regardless of cultural expectations. The family member with the most volatile emotions may gain power through others' desire to avoid conflict. Understanding these unofficial power channels helps explain family dynamics that seem puzzling on the surface. Romantic relationships involve complex power negotiations that evolve over time. Traditional gender roles assign different types of power to men and women, though these expectations have shifted dramatically in recent decades. Financial independence, emotional intelligence, sexual desire, domestic labor, and social connection all represent different currencies of power within intimate relationships. Domestic violence represents power at its most abusive within personal relationships. Abusers typically use multiple tactics to establish and maintain control: isolation, intimidation, emotional manipulation, economic control, and physical violence. Understanding the pattern of coercive control helps explain why leaving such relationships is so difficult. The abuser has systematically undermined the victim's power. Friendship theoretically represents a power relationship between equals, but subtle imbalances often emerge. Who initiates contact? Whose preferences determine shared activities? Who offers emotional support and who receives? Healthy friendships maintain roughly reciprocal exchanges of different forms of power, though perfect balance is rarely achieved or necessary. Communication patterns reveal and reinforce power dynamics in all relationships. Who speaks more frequently? Whose topics dominate conversation? Who interrupts whom? Sociolinguists have documented gender differences in these patterns, with men typically displaying more power-claiming communication behaviors in mixed-gender conversations. Emotional labor, the work of managing emotions to fulfill role expectations, represents another dimension of relational power. Those who perform more emotional maintenance work, remembering birthdays, managing social calendars, smoothing over conflicts, often hold less explicit power while shouldering more invisible responsibility. Recognizing this hidden work helps identify power imbalances that formal arrangements might disguise. Social psychologists John French and Bertram Raven identified 6 bases of interpersonal power that operate in various relationships. Legitimate power, formal authority. Reward power, ability to provide benefits. Coercive power, ability to punish. Expert power, specialized knowledge. Referent power, personal attraction. And informational power, access to valuable information. Understanding these different power bases helps explain why influence works differently across relationships. Disability studies scholars have highlighted how ableism creates power imbalance in relationships involving disabled people. When accessibility is treated as a special accommodation rather than a basic right, disabled people must continually justify their needs, placing them in a subordinate position regardless of their formal status within the relationship. Age represents another axis of relational power that shifts throughout life. The power initially held by parents gradually diminishes as adult children gain independence. Later, aging parents may become dependent on their children, creating complex role reversals that challenge established identities. Societies that venerate elders create different power trajectories than those prioritizing youth. Professional relationships contain their own power dynamics beyond formal hierarchies. Mentorship relationships can be empowering or exploitative depending on how power differences are managed. Workplace friendships exist within organizational power structures that may create conflicting loyalties. Doctor-patient relationships involve asymmetrical knowledge, but ideally shared decision-making. Power in relationships isn't necessarily zero-sum. The concept of power with rather than power over, developed by feminist theorists like Mary Parker Follett, suggests that collaborative power can expand resources for all parties rather than simply redistributing fixed amounts. This perspective helps explain how healthy relationships can navigate inevitable power differences without exploitation. Relationship therapist Terry Real identifies two unhealthy power patterns: overfunctioning and underfunctioning. The overfunctioner takes excessive responsibility and control, while the underfunctioner contributes less and defers decisions. Though appearing to be strong and weak positions, both reflect power distortions that harm the relationship and limit authentic connection. Cultural differences significantly impact relational power expectations. Individualistic societies may value autonomy and independence, while collectivist cultures emphasize harmony and interconnection. What looks like unhealthy dominance in one cultural context might represent expected leadership in another. Cross-cultural relationships require negotiating these different power frameworks. Technology has transformed relational power dynamics in the digital age. Social media creates new forms of visibility and surveillance within relationships. Dating apps shift the initial power balance in romantic connections. Remote work reconfigures workplace relationships. Each technological change requires renegotiating relational power contracts that evolved under different conditions. Healthy relationships aren't necessarily perfectly equal in power at every moment, but they do require mutual consent to power arrangements, flexibility to adjust as circumstances change, and recognition of each person's fundamental dignity regardless of role. Power becomes problematic when it calcifies into rigid dominance or when its exercise lacks accountability.
The Illusion of Free Will, a philosophical exploration introduction. Welcome to a journey that will challenge your most fundamental beliefs about yourself. I'm Your Name, and today we're diving into one of philosophy's most profound questions. Do we truly have free will, or is it merely an illusion? Think about the last decision you made. Perhaps it was clicking on this video, or choosing what to eat for breakfast, or deciding which route to take to work. You likely felt that you made those choices freely, that you could have chosen differently if you'd wanted to. This feeling of agency, of being the author of your own actions, seems undeniable from the inside. It forms the bedrock of our legal systems, our moral judgments, and our very sense of self. But what if this feeling is misleading? What if the sensation of freely choosing is itself determined by factors outside your conscious awareness? What if free will is an elaborate illusion, a story your brain tells itself after decisions have already been made? Today we'll examine the case against free will from philosophical, scientific, and experiential perspectives. We'll explore what neuroscience reveals about our decision-making processes. We'll confront the unsettling question: if your thoughts arise before you choose them, what then is you? And finally, we'll consider how we might live meaningfully even if absolute free will proves to be an illusion. Let me be clear, our goal isn't to definitively settle this ancient debate. Instead, I invite you to approach this exploration with curiosity rather than certainty, to observe your own experience with fresh eyes. And remember, you don't have to figure it all out tonight. Just observe. Part I: Determinism vs. Choice. The philosophical debate about free will begins with a fundamental question: is everything that happens the inevitable result of prior causes? If we accept that the universe operates according to consistent physical laws, then each event, including every neural firing in your brain, follows necessarily from previous conditions. This view, known as determinism, suggests that the entire course of cosmic history, including your decisions, was theoretically predictable from the first moment of the universe. If only one had perfect knowledge of all particles and forces. Consider a simple demonstration. If I drop this pen, it will fall. Its behavior is determined by gravity, air resistance, and other physical forces. No one finds this controversial. But what about your choices? Are they fundamentally different from the falling pen? The challenge of determinism can be stated simply: how can we have genuine choice in a universe where everything, including our thoughts and desires, stems from causes outside our control? You didn't choose your genes. You didn't choose your early childhood experiences. You didn't choose the culture that shaped your values. You didn't choose which thoughts and desires would appear in your consciousness. Yet all these factors profoundly influence your decisions. Some philosophers, called compatibilists, argue that free will and determinism can coexist. They redefine free will not as freedom from causation, but as freedom from external constraint or coercion. On this view, you act freely when you act according to your own desires, even if those desires themselves have deterministic causes. As long as you're not being forced to act against your will is free. Philosopher Harry Frankfurt offered an influential version of this perspective. He suggested that what matters for free will is not whether we could have done otherwise, but whether we identify with our desires. You have free will when you want what you want to want, when your first-order desires align with your second-order desires. The addict who wants to quit but keeps using lacks freedom in this sense. The person who embraces their desire has it. Other philosophers, called libertarians, not to be confused with the political position, reject determinism entirely. They argue that human choice involves something fundamentally different from physical causation, perhaps a soul or a special kind of causation that isn't determined by prior events. Some point to quantum indeterminacy as a possible mechanism for non-determined choice, though critics note that randomness isn't the same as freedom. Hard determinists take the opposite view, embracing determinism and rejecting free will as incompatible with it. They argue that without the ability to do otherwise, genuinely otherwise, not just otherwise if I had different desires, free will is meaningless. Since determinism implies that only one future is possible given the past, we cannot have this kind of freedom. This isn't merely a theoretical debate. Our everyday experience presents both sides of the coin. On one hand, we feel like free agents. On the other, we recognize patterns in our behavior that suggest otherwise. We make the same mistakes repeatedly, despite our best intentions. We find ourselves influenced by environmental factors, from advertising to peer pressure to subtle social cues. We observe how damage to specific brain regions can dramatically alter personality and decision-making. The determinist position gains additional support when we consider how predictable human behavior becomes at the group level. While individual choices may seem spontaneous, large-scale patterns reveal statistical regularities. Marketers, economists, and social scientists rely on these patterns to forecast behavior. Even your supposedly unique preferences and habits likely follow recognizable trajectories when analyzed with sufficient data. The tension between determinism and free will becomes particularly acute when we consider moral responsibility. If your actions result inevitably from prior causes, stretching back before your birth, how can you be truly responsible for them? This question has profound implications for our concepts of praise, blame, desert, punishment, and achievement. Some argue that moral responsibility requires only that we act according to our own reasons and values, not that those reasons and values be uncaused. Others suggest that moral responsibility is a useful fiction, a social practice that shapes behavior, even if it lacks metaphysical foundation. Still others maintain that genuine responsibility requires genuine freedom, and if determinism is true, we must radically revise our moral frameworks. The debate between determinism and choice has persisted for millennia precisely because both positions capture something important about human experience. We are simultaneously subjects and objects, actors who feel free, and organisms whose behavior follows predictable patterns. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing one perspective over the other, but in understanding how both can be true from different levels of description. Part 2. Neuroscience and Unconscious Decision-Making. The ancient philosophical debate about free will has taken a dramatic turn in recent decades as neuroscience provides unprecedented glimpses into the brain's decision-making processes. What these studies reveal challenges our intuitive sense of conscious authorship. The most famous experiments come from neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. Libet asked participants to perform a simple voluntary action, flicking their wrist whenever they felt the urge to do so. He measured three things: the moment of conscious decision, which participants noted by observing a special clock, the electrical activity in motor areas of the brain, measured by EEG, and the actual movement. What Libet discovered was astonishing. The brain activity associated with the movement, what he called the readiness potential, began approximately 550 milliseconds before the action. But participants only became consciously aware of their decision about 200 milliseconds before the action. In other words, the brain began preparing the movement before the person consciously decided to move. Libet's experiments suggested that unconscious brain processes initiate actions before we become consciously aware of our decisions. This finding has been replicated and extended using more sophisticated technologies like fMRI. In 2008, researchers John Dylan Haynes and colleagues found that they could predict simple decisions up to 10 seconds before participants reported making them, based on patterns of brain activity. These studies strike at the heart of our intuitive sense of free will. If neural processes that we have no conscious awareness of are setting our decisions in motion before we experience choosing, what role does conscious choice play? Is consciousness merely observing and claiming ownership of decisions already determined by unconscious mechanisms? Some neuroscientists, like Michael Gazzaniga, have documented fascinating cases of the brain creating post hoc explanations for behaviors. Studies of split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres has been severed, show that the left hemisphere will confidently confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, despite having no access to the actual causes. For instance, if a command to stand up is shown only to the right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body, the person will stand up without the left hemisphere knowing why. When asked why they stood, rather than saying "I don't know," the left hemisphere creates a plausible explanation like "I wanted to get a drink." This suggests that our sense of conscious authorship may sometimes be a narrative constructed after the fact. Neuroscientist David Eagleman compares conscious awareness to a newspaper, which reports events but doesn't cause them. Just as a newspaper might claim to influence events it merely reports on, consciousness might claim authorship of decisions it merely becomes aware of after neural processes have set them in motion. Beyond these laboratory findings, we can observe unconscious influences on decision-making in everyday life. Priming effects demonstrate how exposure to certain stimuli unconsciously affects subsequent behavior. In one famous study, participants walked more slowly after being exposed to words related to old age, without any awareness of the influence. Choice blindness experiments by Lars Hall and Peter Johansson reveal another crack in our sense of conscious authorship. When participants were asked to choose between two faces and then, through sleight of hand, were given the face they didn't choose, most not only failed to notice the switch, but confidently explained why they had chosen the face they were holding, which was actually the face they had rejected. Other studies show that mental fatigue significantly affects decision-making. Judges are more likely to grant parole early in the day or after a break than when tired. Shoppers make different choices at different times of day. These patterns suggest that physiological states we have limited control over substantially influence our choices. Even more fundamental is the role of unconscious emotional processing in decision-making. Neurologist Antonio Damasio's work with patients who have damage to emotional centers of the brain reveals that pure rational analysis, divorced from emotional guidance, leads to decision paralysis. We require emotional signals below conscious awareness, what Damasio calls somatic markers, to evaluate options effectively. The neuroscientific evidence doesn't definitively disprove free will. Some philosophers and scientists argue that consciousness might still play a causal role in complex, extended deliberation, even if simple choices show evidence of unconscious initiation. Others suggest that the readiness potential might reflect preparation to act rather than the decision itself, or that the experimental conditions create artificial situations that don't reflect real-world decision-making. Additionally, Libet himself noted that participants in his studies reported being able to veto the action after becoming aware of the urge, what he called free won't. This suggests consciousness might function more as a veto or approval mechanism than an initiator. Critics also point out limitations in these studies. They typically involve trivial choices without meaningful consequences. The artificial laboratory setting lacks the rich context of real-life decisions, and the timing of conscious awareness is based on subjective reports, which have their own reliability issues. Regardless of these debates, the neuroscientific findings clearly show that unconscious processes play a far greater role in our decisions than introspection suggests. They reveal the limitations of our internal narrative about why we do what we do. At minimum, they suggest that the conscious self is not the sole author of our actions. It may be more like an editor working with material provided by unconscious processes. This scientific picture aligns with observations from contemplative traditions, which have long recognized through introspective investigation that thoughts and intentions arise from somewhere beyond conscious control. As one Zen saying puts it, "You cannot control the waves, but you can learn to surf." Part 3. The question of self.
If your thoughts arise before you choose them, what then is you? This question cuts to the heart of the free will debate and reveals why it matters so deeply to us. Free will isn't merely an abstract philosophical concept, it's intimately connected to our sense of self and identity. When we question free will, we're really asking, who or what am I? Our conventional sense of self includes the feeling of being a conscious agent who authors thoughts and makes decisions. But if thoughts appear in consciousness without being chosen, if desires, preferences, and even logical conclusions simply arise from neural processes we don't control, then who is the I that claims to be choosing? Try a simple experiment. For the next 30 seconds, choose not to think. Decide with your supposed free will to have no thoughts whatsoever. How did that go? If you're like most people, thoughts continue to appear despite your intention to have none. This common experience suggests something profound. We don't generate thoughts through an act of will, we witness thoughts that arise from processes we don't consciously control. The same applies to emotions, sensations, and even intentions. We don't decide to feel angry or happy. These states arise based on conditions. We don't choose to find certain foods delicious or certain people attractive. These preferences appear in consciousness without our willing them. And as the neuroscience studies suggest, even our intentions may form before we become aware of them. This realization can be profoundly destabilizing. If I am not generating my thoughts and choices, then what am I? Am I merely a passive witness to a deterministic unfolding? A biological robot with the illusion of agency? Philosopher Daniel Dennett suggests that the self is not a fixed entity, but a center of narrative gravity, a useful abstraction that helps organize our understanding of behavior, similar to how the concept of a center of gravity helps us understand physical objects. On this view, the self is more like a story than a thing, constructed rather than discovered. Psychologist Bruce Hood proposes that the self is a necessary illusion, not objectively real, but indispensable for navigating the social world. Just as optical illusions persist even when we know they're illusions, our sense of being a unified decision-maker persists despite evidence of its constructed nature. Neuroscientist Anil Seth compares consciousness to a controlled hallucination, the brain's best guess about the causes of its sensory inputs and its own states. From this perspective, our sense of being a conscious agent is itself a model the brain creates to predict its own behavior and that of others. Eastern philosophical traditions have wrestled with these questions for millennia. The Buddhist concept of anatta, or no-self, suggests that what we call self is not a fixed entity but a process, a flowing collection of sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness without a permanent essence. The Hindu tradition speaks of identifying with Atman, the witness consciousness, rather than the changing contents of experience. These traditions offer contemplative methods for directly investigating the nature of self and choice. Through practices like meditation, one can observe how thoughts and intentions arise and pass away without a clear author. This first-person investigation often leads to a radical reconceptualization of what it means to be an agent. Meditation teacher Sam Harris, who also holds a PhD in neuroscience, describes this insight. If you look closely enough, consciousness contains no clear signatures of self. Thoughts simply appear in consciousness, along with desires, emotions, and perceptual objects. But the feeling that you are a thinker of thoughts is itself just another appearance in consciousness. This perspective doesn't necessarily eliminate attributions of responsibility. Even without a fixed self or absolute free will, we can recognize that some collections of causes and conditions, what we call persons, respond to reasons, information, and incentives. Moral and legal frameworks might be understood as ways of influencing these causal systems rather than holding metaphysically free agents accountable. Moreover, the realization that you aren't generating your thoughts doesn't mean consciousness plays no role in behavior. Conscious awareness allows for reflection, deliberation, and the integration of information across time. It enables us to notice patterns in our reactive behaviors and potentially interrupt them. Consciousness might be less like a first cause and more like a crucial feedback mechanism within a complex system. There's a paradox at the heart of the self question. The very entity wondering about its own existence and freedom seems to dissolve under close examination. Yet even if the conventional sense of self is an illusion, something is clearly experiencing that illusion. As philosopher Thomas Metzinger puts it, no one ever was or had a self, but there is an experience of being a self.
Perhaps what we call I is neither an absolute controller nor a helpless witness, but something more subtle, a process that both emerges from and contributes to the causal flow. Neither completely free nor completely determined, but engaged in an ongoing dance of influence with the world. Part 4, Living with the question, so where does this leave us? If free will as we commonly understand it may be an illusion, how do we live with this knowledge? Does it lead to nihilism and despair, or might it open doors to a different kind of freedom? First, let's acknowledge that these questions touch something raw in us. There's a reason philosophers have debated free will for thousands of years. Our intuitive sense of being free agents runs deep. When this intuition is challenged, it can feel like the ground disappearing beneath our feet. But perhaps the discomfort comes not from losing free will, but from losing a particular concept of self, the notion of being an independent controller standing apart from the causal flow of nature. If we could shift our self-understanding, might the free will question appear differently? Consider an alternative perspective. What if you are not a separate self using consciousness, but consciousness itself, witnessing experience as it unfolds? From this viewpoint, your thoughts and decisions aren't really yours in the conventional sense, they arise within consciousness based on countless factors. But in another sense, as consciousness, you are intimately connected to these phenomena as they appear. This shift in perspective, from identifying with a supposed controller to identifying with awareness itself, resembles what contemplative traditions call awakening or liberation. It's not that you gain freedom for the separate self, but that you're freed from the confines of that limited identity. Regardless of your metaphysical stance, there are practical implications to considering free will an illusion. One immediate effect can be greater compassion, both for others and yourself. When we recognize that people don't ultimately choose their genes, formative experiences, brain chemistry, or even their thoughts, it becomes harder to blame and resent them in the same way. This doesn't mean abandoning standards or accountability. We can acknowledge that praise, blame, punishment, and reward serve important functions in shaping behavior without grounding them in metaphysical desert. We can hold people responsible in a forward-looking sense, encouraging positive change without the backward-looking notion that they could have done otherwise given exactly who they were and what they knew at the time. Another potential benefit is reduced egotism. So much suffering comes from excessive identification with I, me, mine. If we see that our achievements and failures alike arise from conditions beyond our absolute control, we might hold them more lightly. This doesn't mean abandoning ambition or effort, but pursuing them with less self-importance and attachment. Some worry that questioning free will might undermine motivation or promote fatalism. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister suggests that when people are exposed to messages denying free will, they may behave less morally in experimental settings. However, other studies indicate that deterministic beliefs can increase compassion and decrease retribution, suggesting mixed effects. These concerns may reflect misunderstandings about the implications of determinism. Recognizing that decisions emerge from prior causes doesn't mean your conscious deliberations have no effect, they're part of the causal chain. Your efforts, aspirations, and values matter tremendously in determining what happens, even if they themselves have causes. In fact, there's a kind of freedom that becomes available when we loosen our grip on the conventional notion of freedom. When we're not constantly trying to assert control as separate selves, we can flow more naturally with life. We can act with less self-consciousness, less second-guessing, less of the paralysis that comes from thinking this decision defines me. There's also liberation in recognizing the constructed nature of our preferences and values. If your desires aren't ultimately yours in some absolute sense, you gain some distance from them. You can observe cravings and aversions arising without complete identification. This doesn't mean becoming passive, but gaining perspective on the wanting self. Some philosophers, like Galen Strawson, suggest that the absence of ultimate free will actually makes life more wondrous. Rather than seeing yourself as a separate agent struggling against the universe, you might recognize yourself as an expression of the universe, a unique convergence of causes and conditions playing themselves out. There's awe in this perspective, a sense of being both insignificant and intimately connected to everything. The determinist perspective also invites attention to conditions rather than willpower alone. Instead of berating yourself for lacking discipline, you might ask what conditions would support the behaviors you value.
This approach often proves more effective than relying on brute force of will, which itself depends on factors like energy, mood, and environmental cues. Ultimately, the question of free will might be less about finding a definitive answer and more about holding the mystery with openness. We can navigate between perspectives, sometimes finding it useful to operate as if we have choice, other times recognizing the vast web of causation beyond our control. This flexibility may be more valuable than certainty. And remember, you don't have to figure it out tonight. Just observe. Notice the thoughts arising, the decisions forming, the sensations of choosing. Watch closely without jumping to conclusions. The deepest insights come not from intellectual positions but from intimate familiarity with your own experience. Perhaps the most profound freedom isn't having absolute choice, but being awake to reality as it is, including the mysterious dance of consciousness, causation, and the ever-changing process we call self. In this awakeness, we find not the isolated freedom of a separate controller, but the boundless freedom of being part of the unfolding whole. Conclusion: we've traveled far in our exploration, from philosophical determinism to cutting-edge neuroscience, from the question of self to practical implications for living. While we haven't definitively resolved the ancient debate about free will, perhaps we've glimpsed something more valuable, a broader perspective on what it means to be human. The evidence suggests that our conventional sense of free will, as conscious authorship of thoughts and decisions, doesn't align with how the mind actually works. Thoughts appear in consciousness without being chosen. Decisions show neural signatures before we're aware of making them. Our explanations for our own behavior often prove to be post hoc justifications rather than accurate accounts. Yet consciousness clearly plays a crucial role in human life. Our ability to reflect, to consider consequences, to recognize patterns in our behavior, to imagine alternatives, these capacities meaningfully shape what happens, even if they're part of the causal flow rather than standing outside it. Perhaps free will isn't something we either have or lack absolutely, but a capacity that admits of degrees. We might be more free when we're self-aware, well-rested, and acting from our deeper values, less free when we're reactive, depleted, or driven by unexamined impulses. Freedom might be less about some metaphysical capacity and more about the relative flexibility and responsiveness of our entire cognitive emotional system. The illusion isn't that we make choices, we do. The illusion is that there's a chooser standing apart from experience, rather than choice being one more phenomenon arising within the interdependent web of causes and conditions that includes what we call self. As we close, I'll leave you with questions rather than answers, not to evade the issues, but because living in the question may be more truthful and ultimately freeing than clinging to premature certainty.